The call came through at 0347 station time, and I had not slept in 26 hours. I was sitting in the cramped back office of Earth's diplomatic suite on Vareth Station, staring at a cold cup of coffee and a document so long it had its own index, when the door opened and my aide, a young Threnny named Sovath, pressed a data chip into my hand without a word. His 4 fingers were shaking. That was how I knew it was serious. Sovath did not shake. In the 3 months I had worked alongside him, I had seen him remain perfectly calm during a fire alarm, a poisoning scare at the species-neutral buffet, and one incident involving a Vorath delegate and a malfunctioning translation collar that I was still not allowed to describe in official reports. If Sovath was shaking, the building was probably on fire in a way that no alarm could measure. I looked at the chip, then I looked at him. "Is it the Accord?" I asked. "They have moved the vote," he said. 48 hours forward. The session opens in 6 hours. I set the coffee down very carefully, the way you set something down when you are afraid that if you move too fast, reality will notice what is happening and make it worse. My name is Kale Reyes. I am, on paper, Earth's first permanent diplomatic ambassador to the Galactic Council. In practice, I am a 43-year-old man from Cardiff who spent 15 years negotiating trade disputes between fishing communities and then somehow ended up in a room with 200 alien species, a rulebook the size of a small car, and a problem that no human being in history had ever faced before. The Galactic Council is the oldest governing body in the known galaxy. It was founded roughly 2,000 years ago by the Elder Races, which is what everyone calls the 7 species that were already traveling between stars when the rest of us were still figuring out agriculture. The Elder Races built the Council's rules, wrote its founding charter, and have shaped every treaty, every resolution, and every standard of diplomatic conduct since the beginning. If you want to understand how the Council works, you need to understand one fundamental principle that sits underneath everything else, like bedrock. Every dispute has a negotiated solution, and the willingness to find that solution is the proof that a species belongs at the table. Nobody says no. That is not a rule written anywhere in the handbook Sovath gave me. It does not need to be. It is the air the whole institution breathes. Humanity joined the Council 30 years ago, after first contact with the Threnny, established that we were a spacefaring species with something approaching coherent governance. We were given observer status, then provisional membership, then a small suite of offices on Varath Station, and a seat at the back of the chamber, with a very small nameplate. We were considered promising but unpredictable. Most species that joined the Council at our developmental stage took anywhere from 50 to 100 years to be considered full participants in major decisions. We had been trying to compress that timeline, which is why they sent me instead of a career alien affairs specialist. I had a reputation for finding solutions that made everyone slightly unhappy in equal measure, which is apparently the closest thing to diplomatic genius that humans produce. The Varath Accord was not a new problem. It had been building for years, long before I arrived. 3 star systems near the edge of what the Council called the Outer Reach contained human colonies, established under the original membership agreement, that happened to sit on mineral deposits that the Vorath Dominion had decided were strategically important. The Vorath were one of the Elder Races. They did not ask for things directly. What they did instead was introduce a treaty, the Varath Accord, which reframed the legal status of Outer Reach territories in a way that would, over the course of about 10 years of bureaucratic process, transfer effective control of those systems to a council-administered body, in which the Vorath held majority influence. It was elegant, as these things go. 40,000 humans lived in those 3 systems. They had built homes there, planted crops, raised children, buried their dead. The Accord did not say it was removing them. It said it was reorganizing jurisdictional frameworks for the mutual benefit of all council members. The humans would still be there. They just would not own anything anymore. When the full text reached Earth 6 weeks ago, I was already on Vareth Station and already in the middle of trying to understand it. The document was 912 pages long. I read all of it. I have a habit of reading things completely before I talk about them, which is not a common trait among politicians, but is apparently valuable in fishing rights mediation and, it turns out, interstellar diplomacy. I sent my analysis home with a cover note that said, simply, "This is designed to be negotiated down. The original version is extreme on purpose. The Vorath expect us to spend 6 months bargaining, and they expect to end up with something that looks like a compromise but still gives them what they actually want. The question is not whether we can improve the terms. We probably can. The question is whether any version of this accord is acceptable, because even the most favorable outcome we could realistically negotiate still transfers meaningful control of 3 human systems to an institution the Vorath effectively run. I recommend we think very carefully before we sit down at that table." Earth thought very carefully. It took them 4 days, which in governmental terms is nearly instantaneous. The response came from the Secretary General's office directly, which was unusual. It was 3 sentences long. "We have reviewed the accord and your analysis. We agree that no negotiated version of this document serves Earth's interests or the interests of our people in the outer reach. Tell them no." I read it 3 times. Then I called the Secretary General's office to confirm it was not a draft that had been sent by accident. It was not a draft. I sat with that answer for 2 days, while Sovath walked me through the diplomatic handbook and pointed out, with the calm precision of someone delivering genuinely terrible news, that there was no formal procedure in Council history for a member state to simply refuse to negotiate a tabled treaty. There were procedures for counterproposals. There were procedures for requesting extensions, for citing procedural violations, for appealing to the Elder Race Review Committee. There was a remarkably detailed section on how to formally request a translation recheck if you believed you had misunderstood the document. There was no procedure for saying no. What happens if a species just refuses? I asked him. Sovath considered this in the way he considered most things, which was with an expression of careful neutrality that I had come to understand meant he was trying to find a gentle way to say something not gentle. "It has not happened," he said. "In 2,000 years of Council history, it has not happened. There must be some protocol, some baseline assumption. The baseline assumption," Sovath said slowly, "is that it will not happen." 6 hours later, I walked into the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council and said 2 words that apparently no ambassador in 2,000 years had said on the official record. The chamber held 400 seats, arranged in a descending arc around a central speaking floor, tiled in polished black stone that reflected everything above it like dark water. The Elder Race delegations sat in the upper tiers, their seats slightly larger, their nameplates slightly more prominent. I had been told this was not a deliberate hierarchy but an artifact of the original architectural plans. I believed that the way I believed most things people say when they do not want to admit what something means. First Tung Ureska of the Vorath Dominion presided from the upper center position, which was technically a rotating role, but had been occupied by a Vorath representative for the last 40 years. He was tall by any species standard, with a broad flat face and eyes that sat at the very outer edges of his head, giving him a field of vision that I had read in my briefing materials was nearly 360 degrees. He had a voice that seemed to come from the floor rather than his mouth, low and resonant, and when he spoke it had the quality of something that expected to be obeyed. He read the formal description of the Vorath Accord. He noted that Earth's diplomatic mission had been provided full documentation 6 weeks prior. He noted that the Council's standard negotiation period had been offered, and, he said with a pause that seemed designed to give me one final opportunity to announce a counter-proposal, not yet utilized. He asked if the Earth delegation had a response to the accord as tabled. I stood up. Every head in the room turned. 400 different kinds of eyes, some compound, some multifaceted, some just deeply strange, all pointed at me. I was aware, in a very physical way, of being a single human being in a room that had been built for a purpose I was about to disrupt. I said, "We decline." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Ureska's wide-set eyes moved fractionally. Somewhere in the middle tiers, something that sounded like a very controlled intake of breath passed through an alien respiratory system. Sovath, seated behind me at the aides bench, went absolutely still in the way that very small animals go still when a very large something walks past. Ureska said, in a tone that had not changed at all but somehow felt much colder than before. "The Earth delegation is invited to specify which elements of the accord it wishes to bring to the negotiation table." "No elements," I said. "We are not entering negotiation. We decline the accord." The silence broke. It did not break gently. I will not pretend I felt calm in that moment. My heart was moving at a speed that my doctor would have described as medically inadvisable. But I had read the accord 912 pages of it, and I had read Earth's 3-sentence reply, and I had spent 2 days sitting with both of them, and the thing I kept coming back to was this: some tables are set up so that the only way to win is not to sit down. The chamber noise rose around me like a tide. Ureska called for order. Delegates from 7 different species were speaking simultaneously through their translation collars, and the collars were working very hard to convert whatever they were saying into something my earpiece could render in English. What came through was a layered mess of procedural confusion, genuine disbelief, and in at least 2 cases, what the translation software rendered as a tone of voice it could only describe as historically unprecedented alarm. I sat back down. Sovath leaned forward from behind me, and in a very quiet voice that was trying very hard to sound like it was not panicking, he said, "Ambassador, no one has ever done this." "I know," I said. "The handbook does not have a category for this." "I know. They are going to be very upset." "Yes," I said. I picked up my coffee cup, which was empty, and held it anyway because I needed something to do with my hands. "They are." Outside the great curved windows of the chamber, the stars of the outer reach were visible as a faint scatter of light against the black. 40,000 people lived out there, in 3 systems, in homes they had built with their own hands. They had not negotiated their way into those homes. They had simply gone there and built things and stayed. I thought about that as the chamber continued to erupt around me. Some things, I was beginning to understand, run deeper than policy, deeper than procedure, deeper than 2,000 years of carefully maintained diplomatic tradition. Humans never had a predator that taught us to back down when something bigger snarled at us. Every other species in this room had learned, somewhere in their evolutionary history, that when a greater force pushes, you yield and find another way. It was how they survived. It was, in many ways, how they built this whole institution. We just never learned that particular lesson. And right now, in this room, that gap in our education was causing 2,000 years of galactic order to make a sound I did not have a word for. I put the empty coffee cup down. I straightened my jacket. I waited. Whatever came next, Earth had been very clear. We were not moving. The next morning, Sovath appeared at my office door, at what would have been sunrise if Varath Station had a sun, which it did not, and set a very long printed document on my desk without a word. I looked at it. It was a formal notice of procedural violation, stamped with the seal of the Elder Race Review Committee, and it was 47 pages long. The 47 pages were, in essence, a very thorough way of saying that what I had done the previous day had no recognized legal category in 2,000 years of council history, and therefore the committee was not entirely certain how to respond, and therefore they were creating a new procedural category on the spot, and the humans were in it, and it was not a good category to be in. I read all 47 pages. Then I sent them to Earth with a note that said, "We appear to have invented a new type of diplomatic problem." Earth's reply arrived in 3 hours. It said, "Good, keep going." Ureska sent a personal message that afternoon. It was framed as an informal communication, which in council diplomatic language meant it was off the record, which meant it was the kind of thing said when someone wanted to give you one final chance to change course before the official response became something much harder to walk back from. His message was 7 paragraphs long and translated, through several layers of formal Vorath diplomatic register that Sovath helped me decode, to something close to, "You have made an error. You may still correct it, and we strongly suggest that you do." I drafted a reply. I showed it to Sovath. He read it, set it down, and said, "Is this the reply Earth has approved?" Earth said, "Keep going." I told him, "That is not a specific approval of this particular reply." "It is directionally consistent," I said. Sovath made a small sound that I had learned to interpret as the Threnny equivalent of a person who can see a disaster coming and has decided there is no longer any point in mentioning it. He handed me back the draft. I sent it. The reply to Urfis Ka was polite, brief, and said exactly what Earth had told me to say. The position of the Earth delegation remained unchanged. We had reviewed the accord. We declined it. We were not entering negotiation. What I did not say, because I did not yet know how to say it without it sounding like a provocation, was the thing I had been thinking since I sat down in that chamber and felt the room erupt around me. The thing I had been turning over in my mind since Sovath told me that no one had ever done this in 2,000 years of Council history. The Galactic Council had been built on a principle that sounded like wisdom but was, I was starting to think, something else entirely. The principle was that all disputes could be resolved through negotiation, and therefore all parties must be willing to negotiate, and therefore refusal to negotiate was not a diplomatic position, but a breakdown of civilization itself. It was a beautiful idea. It had probably kept 1,000 wars from starting, but underneath it, if you pressed on it carefully, was something that did not feel quite right. It assumed that all parties came to the table with equal standing. It assumed that negotiation was a search for mutual benefit, rather than a structured process by which the more powerful party extracted concessions from the less powerful one, while everyone maintained the polite fiction that this was not what was happening. It assumed that the alternative to negotiation was always worse. I was not sure all of those assumptions were true, and I was beginning to suspect that I was not the only one in this station who had noticed. On the second day after my declaration, I received 3 messages through secure personal channels from delegates I had never spoken to directly. One was from the representative of the Keth Collective, a mid-tier species that had been council members for about 200 years. One was from a junior delegate in the Miraki Neutral Observers block. One was from a species called the Sorel, whose name I honestly had to look up, because they were so quiet in council proceedings that I had not registered they were there. All 3 messages were careful and indirect in the way that messages are when the person sending them has been trained their entire life not to say directly what they mean. But they were saying the same thing, underneath the careful indirection. They were saying, "We noticed what you did. We have questions." I did not reply immediately. I showed the messages to Sovath, who read them and then sat quietly for a long time. "These species," he said finally, "the Keth, the Miraki, the Sorel, do you know what they have in common?" I said I did not. "They each have outstanding disputes with elder race members that have been in procedural limbo for decades. The Keth have an energy rights disagreement with the Vorath that dates back 80 years. The Miraki have a territorial classification issue with the Thren Elder Block that has never reached a vote. The Sorel have a resource access petition that was tabled in committee 23 years ago and has not moved since." Sovath paused. In each case, the standard diplomatic advice given to these species when they raised their concerns was that they should continue to seek a negotiated resolution. I looked at him, and none of them ever just said no. "It is not done," he said. And then, after a moment, more quietly, "It was not done." I thought about the Keth observer in the chamber, leaning toward me during the session, asking in a low voice, "You truly will not move?" And the way they had nodded when I said no, not in agreement, more like recognition, like someone seeing a door they had not known was there. That evening, the Vorath requested an emergency session of the full council for the following day. The stated purpose was to address Earth's procedural violation and establish a formal response. The unstated purpose, which was obvious to everyone, was to make an example. I sent a message home that night. It was longer than my usual reports, and less formal. I told them what I had noticed. I told them about the 3 messages. I told them that I was increasingly convinced that what we had done by saying no was not just a refusal of the accord. It was something that had not existed in this institution before, and its existence was making people think thoughts that the institution had not been built to accommodate. I asked if Earth had anticipated this, if it was part of the plan. The reply came from the Secretary General directly, at 2 in the morning station time, which told me he was not sleeping either. It said, "We hoped. We did not know for certain. Keep going, Kale, but be careful. What you are describing is not just diplomatic pressure. If you are right about what those species are thinking, you are describing the beginning of something much larger than the accord. Make sure you understand what you are holding before you decide how to carry it." I read that 3 times, in the dark of my office with the lights of the outer reach visible through the window, and I thought about 40,000 people in 3 systems who had simply gone somewhere and built something and refused, without anyone telling them to be moved. I thought, maybe that is where I learned it. The emergency session was 12 hours away. I poured myself a glass of water, because the coffee was finally gone, and I sat down to think about what came next. The Vorath expected to walk into that chamber and close the door they had watched me open. They expected a room full of species who would vote with the Elder Race bloc because that was what you did. That was what you had always done. Because the alternative had never been something you could picture. I was beginning to think the alternative was getting easier to picture by the hour. And that, I suspected, was what was really terrifying Uraska. Not the refusal, not the procedural chaos, not even the violation of 2,000 years of diplomatic tradition. The idea that someone had shown the room that the door existed, and that some of the people in that room were now standing up to walk toward it. The emergency session began at what Vareth Station designated as the 9th hour, and I arrived 8 minutes early, which was unusual for me. I am not, by nature, someone who arrives early to things. I am someone who arrives exactly on time after telling myself for 20 minutes that I have more time than I do. But that morning I was in my seat before half the chamber had filtered in, and I sat there with my hands folded on the table in front of me, and watched the room fill. Sovath sat behind me. He had said almost nothing that morning, which was its own kind of communication. He had handed me a briefing document at breakfast that outlined the Vorath's expected procedural moves, their likely voting bloc, the formal penalties they were authorized to impose on a member state found in procedural violation. He had color-coded it. The red sections were long. The chamber filled slowly and with more noise than usual. I could see it in the way species clustered differently than they normally did at the start of a session. In a normal session, delegates moved to their seats with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times and expected nothing to surprise them. That morning, there were clusters, small groups pausing in the aisles, leaning toward each other, translation collars flickering as whispered conversations moved too fast for the ambient filters to keep up. I could not hear what anyone was saying, but the body language of 200 alien species, however different they were from each other, all carried some version of the same signal. Something was happening, and they were not sure yet which direction it was going to fall. Uraska took his position in the upper center, before anyone else from the elder race tier had settled. That was unusual too. He was already composed, already set, already looking down at the floor of the chamber, with the particular stillness of someone who has decided what they are going to do, and has nothing left to be uncertain about. I had been briefed on Vorath physiognomy enough to know that the very slight forward tilt of his upper frame was not a relaxed posture. It was the posture of a predator that has already calculated the distance and is simply waiting for the right moment. I unfolded my hands and picked up my water glass. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. The session was called to order. Uraska did not waste time on preamble. He was too good a diplomat for that. He stated the matter directly. The Earth delegation had, in the previous session, declined to engage with a formally tabled treaty through any recognized council procedure, creating a situation without precedent in the institution's history. The Elder Race Review Committee had convened and determined that this constituted a Category 1 procedural breach, a designation that had been created specifically to describe Earth's behavior, because no prior designation existed. The Council was now invited to determine the appropriate response. He then outlined the responses the committee recommended, in order of escalating severity. The first was a formal censure of the Earth delegation, to be entered into the permanent record. The second was a schedule of financial penalties applied to Earth's trade agreements within Council-administered space, beginning at a rate that would meaningfully affect the economic agreements Earth had spent the last decade building. The third was a restriction on Earth vessels' docking access to 7 major stations in the Council network, effective immediately upon vote. The fourth, held in reserve, was a motion to suspend Earth's Council membership pending a review of whether we met the foundational requirements for membership at all. He read all 4. The chamber was quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. Then he looked at me. Not the way you look at someone you are talking to, the way you look at something you are about to move. The Earth delegation, he said, is invited to indicate whether it wishes to revise its position before the council proceeds to vote. I stood up. The room did that thing again. The thing it had done the first time, where 400 sets of attention landed on me all at once, and the weight of it was something you could almost feel. But it was different now. The first time, the attention had felt like a wall, like 2,000 years of institutional certainty staring at one person who had said something outside the bounds of what was allowed. Now it felt like something else. It felt like waiting. Like a room full of people who wanted to know what came next, not because they were certain it would confirm what they expected, but because they were no longer certain of that at all. I said, "The position of the Earth delegation remains unchanged. We decline the Varath Accord. We are not entering negotiation." Oreska held my gaze for 3 full seconds. In human terms, that is nothing. In the context of a formal council session, where every pause is measured and meaningful, 3 seconds is a very deliberate choice. Then he called the vote on the first measure, the formal censure. It passed, 83 to 41, with the rest abstaining. I logged it, acknowledged it on the record, and sat back down. The vote on the financial penalties. It passed, 79 to 44. The restriction on docking access. Passed, 76 to 47. Each vote passed. Each time, I acknowledged it. Each time, the margin was slightly smaller. And each time, the chamber got a little quieter, in a way that was different from the silence of people who agreed. It was the silence of people who were watching the numbers and thinking about them. The fourth measure, the membership suspension review, was tabled for a formal hearing rather than an immediate vote. That required its own procedure, its own committee, its own timeline. Ureska moved through the formalities with perfect precision. He was very good at what he did. I want to be clear about that. He was not cruel or foolish. He was implementing a system he believed in, because the system had worked for 2,000 years and had built something genuinely remarkable. I did not think he was wrong to defend it. I just thought he was about to discover that it had a crack in it he had never needed to look for before. The crack appeared in the form of a single question asked aloud during the open comment period that followed the votes. Open comment was a formality at most sessions, a brief window during which any delegate could make a registered statement before the session closed. It was rarely used for anything significant. Most delegates who had something real to say arranged private meetings or submitted written communications, because the floor of the Grand Chamber was not a safe place to say something that might put you at odds with the elder race bloc, without very careful preparation. The delegate who stood up was from the Meraki Neutral Observer Mission. She was junior, which meant she was either very brave or did not fully understand what she was about to do. She had a translator voice that the callers rendered in a flat, clear tone, and what she said was not directed at me. It was directed at the chamber in general, in the carefully indirect way of someone who has thought very hard about exactly how to phrase something. She said, "This session has established that refusing to negotiate is a Category 1 procedural breach. This delegation wishes to note, for the record, that we understand the importance of that principle to the functioning of this council. We also wish to note that the principle appears to apply differently depending on who is refusing. The Meraki Territorial Classification Petition has been in procedural limbo for 17 years. We have been advised, repeatedly, to continue seeking a negotiated resolution. We have complied. We have sought. No resolution has been forthcoming. We would appreciate clarification on whether the remedies applied today are also available to member states whose desire for resolution has not been met by the other party." She sat down. The silence that followed was of a quality I had not encountered before in any diplomatic context. It was not the silence of a room in agreement. It was not the silence of a room in shock. It was the silence of a room in which a very large number of individuals were simultaneously doing a calculation they had never done in exactly this way before, and arriving at results that made them feel something complicated. Ureska said, with absolute control, that the Meraki petition was a separate matter and would be addressed through appropriate channels. The Meraki delegate did not respond. She did not need to. The question was already in the room. It was going to stay there. I did not look at Sovath. I looked at my water glass. But I could feel, in the particular way you feel a room shift when you have spent enough years in rooms, that something had changed. The Vorath had walked in, expecting to close a door. They had closed several doors, technically speaking. The censure was in the record. The penalties were in the record. The docking restrictions were real and would cost Earth actual money and actual inconvenience. But a different door, one they had not known was there, was open now. And the Myraki delegate had just walked through it in front of 400 delegates and asked a question out loud that she had probably been carrying quietly for 17 years. After the session, as the chamber cleared, I sat for an extra moment. Sovath appeared at my shoulder and said nothing. He was doing the thing he did when he was processing something larger than his usual categories. A delegate passed my table on the way to the exit, close enough that I could have touched them without reaching. It was the Keth Collective representative, an individual named something my earpiece rendered as a three-tone sound I had been assigned to think of as resonance, which was not a name exactly but was the closest translation. Resonance slowed as they passed my table. They did not stop. They did not look at me directly. But as they moved past, I heard, very quietly, through my translator earpiece, 80 years. That was all. 2 words. They kept walking. 80 years. That was how long the Keth's dispute with the Vorath over energy rights had been in procedural limbo. 80 years of being advised to seek a negotiated resolution. 80 years of compliance. 80 years of doing what you were supposed to do when something told you that you had to. I sat there in the emptying chamber and thought, this is not about the Accord anymore. It probably had not been about the Accord for a while. It was about what the Accord represented, and what our refusal of it represented, and what that refusal looked like to species that had been sitting in procedural limbo for decades, politely seeking resolution, never saying the word that no one in this institution had ever said out loud on the official record until 6 days ago. No. Just no. I picked up my things. I walked out of the chamber, and I started thinking very carefully about what to do with what I was holding. That night, I did not sleep. I sat at the desk in my office with a blank document open, and the lights of the station dimmed to their nighttime setting, and I tried to write a report that accurately described what was happening. The problem was that I kept deleting it and starting over, because every version I wrote sounded either too alarming or not alarming enough, and I could not find the version that was simply honest. What I was trying to say was this. I came here to do a specific job. I came here to represent Earth's interests in a specific dispute about a specific treaty affecting 3 specific star systems. I had done that job. Earth's position was on the record. The Accord was, at least for the moment, stalled. We had taken penalties that were real but survivable, and we had not moved. But the thing that was happening now was not the job I came here to do. The thing that was happening now was that 48 hours of one species saying no, in a room where no one had ever said no before, had started a reaction I did not have a formula for. Species that had been quiet for decades were sending me careful, indirect messages that all said the same thing, underneath the care and indirection. The Myraki delegate had stood up in open session and asked a question that was technically procedural and actually historic. Resonance had walked past my table and told me, in 2 words, how long they had been waiting. There were 12 other mid-tier species in the council with outstanding disputes that had been in procedural limbo for periods ranging from 9 years to 114 years. I had a list. Sovath had made me a list because Sovath understood, before I fully did, that this was the information I was going to need. I had read the list that afternoon, and what struck me was not any single entry on it, but the pattern across all of them. Every dispute on the list involved a mid-tier species on one side, and either an elder race member or an elder race-aligned block on the other. Every dispute had been labeled, at some point in its history, as requiring further negotiation. Every dispute was still open. The framework of the council, the beautiful 2,000-year-old framework that had kept 1,000 wars from starting, had a shape. The shape was not perfectly circular, the way its founding documents described it. The shape was a funnel. The top was wide and welcoming, and every species was invited in, and the language of mutual benefit and shared governance was genuinely meant. I believed that. But the bottom of the funnel was narrow, and it was controlled by the species that had built it, and the long procedural pathways that led from dispute to resolution had a way of cycling indefinitely when the other party in a dispute happened to be one of the species that controlled the bottom of the funnel. Nobody said no because no one had ever shown that saying no was survivable. We were in the process of showing that it was. I finished my report at 3 in the morning. It was longer than my usual reports, and it said, in careful and precise language, that what was happening on Varath Station was no longer just about the Varath Accord. It said that the Earth delegation's refusal had exposed a structural feature of the Council that had not previously been available for examination, and that several member species appeared to be in the early stages of examining it. It said that I could not predict where this was going, but that I believed the next 2 weeks would determine whether the Council experienced a significant realignment or moved to reassert control in a way that would require Earth to make decisions about how much pressure we were willing to sustain. And then I wrote one more paragraph, outside the formal report, just for the Secretary General directly. I wrote, I want to be honest with you. I am not afraid of what we are doing. I think it is right. But I am starting to understand that it is much bigger than I thought when I stood up in that chamber and said 2 words. If the species I am describing move, if they start pushing on things that have been immovable for decades, the Council's elder race bloc will not respond the way they responded to us. We are new and small and easy to penalize without threatening the structure. But the Keth have been here for 200 years, the Myraki for 300. If they decide that no is an option, the room changes in ways I cannot fully model from here. I need to know if you anticipated this, and I need to know how far you want me to go. I sent the report. Then I lay down on the narrow couch in the corner of my office and listened to the sound of the station's ventilation system and the very faint background hum of the stars outside, and thought about the Myraki delegate standing up in open session and asking her question, 17 years of quiet compliance and careful seeking of resolution, and then one morning she stood up and said, "Why does the rule only work one way?" I was asleep when the Secretary General's reply arrived. Sovath woke me at 6 to hand me the message, and I read it sitting up with my jacket still on from the night before. It said, "We anticipated the Accord collapsing. We did not fully anticipate this. We should have, and I want to be honest with you about that too. Regarding how far to go, your judgment, you are there. We are not. What we can tell you is that Earth's position has not changed, and it will not change, and you have whatever support we can give you. The question of what the other species do is theirs to answer, not ours. But if they answer it, do not stand in the way. This is bigger than the Accord. We know that now." I read it twice. Then I got up, drank a glass of water, put on a clean jacket, and went to find Resonance of the Keth Collective. I had been making a list of my own. I did not send meeting requests through the official council scheduling system. That would have created a record, and records in this institution were read by people other than the people they were meant for. Instead, I asked Sovath to send informal personal notes, the kind of communication that the Council's own diplomatic handbook acknowledged as existing outside the formal record, to the representatives of the species on my list. The notes said only that the Earth delegation would welcome the opportunity for informal conversation, at a time of their choosing, in whatever setting was most comfortable for them. Over the following 3 days, I had 11 conversations. I will not describe all of them in detail, because some of what was said in those conversations was said in the expectation of privacy, and I intend to honor that expectation. What I will say is that the pattern I had suspected from reading their messages and Sovath's list was real. Every one of those 11 representatives carried something that had the same shape, though they described it differently. They carried the weight of disputes that had been cycling for years, decades in most cases, through a framework that was supposed to resolve them but had not. They carried the careful learned habit of never saying the thing directly, of always finding the procedural path, of always seeking the negotiated resolution. And they carried something else, something I had not fully expected to find. They carried the memory of when they had first been told that this was how it worked. The first time they had come to the council with a problem and been handed the handbook and told that the answer was always somewhere in that process, and they had believed it, and they had followed the process, and the process had not produced the answer it promised. In each conversation, I said approximately the same thing. I said, "I cannot tell you what to do. I cannot promise you what the outcome will be if you decide to change your position in your own disputes. I cannot protect you from the response of the elder race bloc, which will be real and probably significant. What I can tell you is that Earth said no, and we are still here. The station did not explode. The council did not collapse. The penalties are real, but we are surviving them. No is survivable. That is the only thing I know for certain right now that you might not have known before. Resonance said something to me in our conversation that I wrote down afterward, word for word, because I did not want to lose it. They said, in Keth culture, there is a concept that translates roughly as the floor of the cage. It refers to the point at which a trapped creature stops testing the walls and begins to behave as though the cage is simply its natural environment. We have been in procedural limbo with the Vorath for 80 years. I am no longer certain whether we are still testing the walls or whether we have reached the floor of the cage and stopped noticing it is there. Your delegation did something in that chamber. I do not know yet whether it was wise or reckless, but it reminded me that the wall exists, and that is not a small thing. I drove back to my office that evening and sat with that for a long time. The Council's Emergency Committee had announced a full session in 4 days, the largest formal gathering since the founding anniversary ceremonies, to address the ongoing procedural situation and determine a path forward. The Vorath were calling it a restoration of order. Every communication coming from the Elder Race block used the word restoration. It was a careful word. It implied that something had been disrupted that was correct and proper, and that correctness and properness could be restored if the disruption was addressed. What it did not account for was the possibility that some of the people in that chamber were no longer entirely sure that what existed before the disruption was what they wanted restored. I wrote in my personal log that night, the one I kept separate from the official reports. The Vorath think this session is going to close the door. They are very organized, very determined, and very experienced. They may be right. The machinery of 2,000 years of institutional inertia is a powerful thing, and most of the species in this room have spent their entire political lives learning to work within it rather than against it. But Resonance used the word cage, and I keep thinking about the way the Miraki delegate sat down after her question, very still, and did not look at Urus-Ka. Not the way you avoid looking at something you respect. The way you avoid looking at something you have just decided you are no longer afraid of. 4 days to the full session. I was not sleeping much. I did not think anyone on Varath Station was sleeping much. The morning of the full session, I woke up to find 3 pieces of news waiting for me, and they were each significant, in ways that interacted with each other, in a way that made the morning feel very strange and very large. The first was that the Keth Collective had, overnight, submitted a formal written demand, not a petition, and not a request for procedural review, a demand for resolution of their 80-year energy rights dispute with the Vorath. The document used language that had no precedent in council communications. It did not request negotiation. It stated a position and asked for a response that either accepted that position or constituted a formal refusal. It used the word refusal. It borrowed it directly from the category that Earth had accidentally created. The second was that 4 other species, none of them from my list of 11, had submitted documents of varying formality that all carried the same underlying signal. They were not demands yet, they were questions. But they were questions of the kind that contain, inside them, the shape of a demand. The third was a personal message from a Vorath diplomatic official I had never interacted with directly, a mid-level member of their station staff named, in translation, something that I was told to render as correct understanding. Correct Understanding's message was brief and did not go through official channels. It said, First Tung Urus-Ka requests that Ambassador Reyes visit his private office before the session opens. This is not a formal request. The last sentence meant it was also not optional, in the way that things the Vorath said were not optional without technically being commands. I went. Urus-Ka's private office was in the Elder Race tier of the station, which meant it was larger than my entire suite and had windows that faced the open dark rather than the interior docking rings. He was standing when I arrived, not seated, and the difference was significant. A seated Vorath in a formal context is communicating institutional authority. A standing one is communicating something more personal, though the Vorath diplomatic training made it impossible to tell immediately what the personal thing was. He did not offer me a seat. I stood also. You are not afraid, he said. It was not a question. I considered the statement. I am afraid of some things, I said. I am afraid of what happens to the people in the outer reach if we get this wrong. I am afraid of the ways this situation is larger than anything I was trained for. I am afraid of getting on a call with Earth and having to tell them something went badly wrong because I misjudged something I should have understood better. But not of the Council, HFY said. Not of this institution. Not of the response we have brought against your delegation. The penalties are real, I said. We are not dismissing them. That is not what I mean. I waited. He turned to the window for a moment, which was unusual. The Vorath's wide field of vision meant that turning away from someone was not the same physical signal for them that it was for humans, but the posture still read as deliberate. He was choosing to do something that looked like looking away. 2,000 years, he said, to the window. There have been disputes in this council that I was taught, as a student, could not be resolved by force, because force would destroy what was being contested. The framework exists because the alternative, the thing before the framework, was a galaxy in which force was the only argument. Every species that sits in that chamber carries the history of what came before, the wars, the losses, the damage that did not heal for generations. The framework was built to prevent that from happening again. I understand that, I said. And I did. Genuinely, he turned back to me. Not because you refused the accord. The accord is a document. It can be rewritten. What you have done is demonstrate that the framework has a boundary, that there is a point at which a member state can say, I will not participate in this process, and you have survived saying it. Do you know what that means to species that have been in this institution for 2 centuries? Yes, I said. I think I do. He was quiet for a moment. The session today will not go the way you expect. I don't have specific expectations, I said. I have a position. The position has not changed. I know. He sat down then, which was a different signal, and for a moment, he looked less like the first tongue of the Vorath Dominion, and more like someone who had been managing a very complicated structure for a very long time, and had just noticed a crack he was not sure he could repair. I am going to tell you something that is not for the record. All right. There are 3 elder race delegations that have indicated they will not vote with the Vorath bloc today on the membership suspension review. Not against it, they will abstain. And I want you to understand something about what an abstention from an elder race bloc member means in this institution. It has happened 11 times in 2,000 years, twice in my own tenure. Each time, it meant the beginning of a realignment that took decades to resolve. He paused. Each time, it was caused not by a new species saying something unexpected, but by a dispute between the existing members that had been suppressed long enough that it found another way out. I thought about resonance, about 80 years, about the floor of the cage. The Keth document, I said. Yes, and other things that have been building for longer than the Keth dispute. The accord was a mistake on our part, not the goal of it. The timing. We moved too quickly, on a situation that was already under stress, and we created a focal point. He looked at me steadily. I am not asking you to change your position. I know that you will not, and I have come to understand that your government is not going to change it either. I am telling you that the session today is going to produce an outcome that neither of us fully controls, and I thought you should walk in knowing that. I said, why are you telling me this? He considered it. Because you are going to be here for a long time, Ambassador Reyes, and I would prefer that the person who started something this significant understands it clearly. I thanked him. I walked back to my office. I sat down and looked at the blank wall across from my desk for about 4 minutes and did not think about anything in particular, which is a thing I do when something is too large to think about directly and needs to settle into a shape I can work with. Then I put on my jacket and went to the Grand Chamber. The full session of the Galactic Council was called to order at the 9th hour. The chamber was at absolute capacity for the first time in 11 years, which I learned from Sovath as we took our seats. Every delegation had sent its senior representative. The observer galleries were full. The ambient noise when the chamber was still technically in pre-session was louder than most sessions got at their peak. HFY took the presiding position. He looked exactly as he always looked, composed, precise, radiating the particular authority of someone who has occupied a position of power for long enough that the authority has become architectural. You could take him out of the chamber, and the authority would still be there, built into the way he held himself. He opened the session by stating its purpose, to address the ongoing procedural situation created by the Earth delegation's categorical refusal of a tabled treaty, to determine appropriate institutional response, and to reaffirm the foundational principles of the Council's framework. He said the word reaffirm very carefully. I noticed. The first part of the session moved through formal statements from several elder race delegations, all of which said, in various registers of diplomatic language, approximately the same thing. The framework must be upheld. The principle of negotiated resolution is foundational, and the Council must demonstrate that this principle applies to all members without exception. Then the open address period began. I had not been told who would speak during open address. Sovath had told me that 7 delegations had registered to speak, which was unusually high. They spoke in the order they had registered. The first 3 were elder race-aligned delegations making procedural arguments in support of the suspension review. They were thorough and well-prepared and said nothing surprising. The 4th speaker was the Keth Collective's senior representative, not Resonance, who was the junior representative I had spoken to, but the senior, a figure I had seen in the chamber many times but never heard speak at length. Their address was 11 minutes long. It did not address the Earth situation directly for most of its duration. Instead, it described, in precise and documented detail, the history of the Keth Collective's energy rights dispute with the Vorath Dominion. It cited dates, communications, procedural filings, and the formal responses to each. It described a framework that had, over 80 years, consistently found reasons why resolution was not yet possible. It described what 80 years of consistent deferred resolution does to a community that depends on the energy rights in question. And then, at the end, the senior Keth representative said, the Earth delegation's refusal of the Varath Accord has been classified as a Category 1 procedural breach. The Keth Collective respectfully submits that 80 years of an elder race member's refusal to substantively engage with a legitimate dispute is a category of breach for which no designation currently exists, and which this session might usefully address alongside the matter at hand. They sat down. The 5th speaker was from a species called the Drell, who I had not spoken to, and who were not on my list. They had been on Varath Station for 60 years. Their dispute, which I had not known about before Sovath quickly summarized it for me as they stood to speak, involved a resource mapping disagreement with the Thren Elder Block that had been cycling in procedural review for 31 years. Their address was shorter than the Keth's, and said one thing very clearly. The principle of mandatory negotiated resolution should apply equally to all parties in a dispute, and the Council should be willing to say so on the record. The 6th speaker was the Miraki delegate again, the same junior representative who had asked her question in the previous session. She stood up and said only, the Miraki Neutral Observer Delegation endorses the position stated by the Keth Collective and the Drell Confederation. We have no further statement. She sat down. The 7th speaker was from a species so small and so quiet in council proceedings that I genuinely had to look their nameplate up to confirm who they were. They had been council members for 114 years. Their outstanding dispute was the oldest on my list. The senior representative stood and said, we came to this council 114 years ago. We were told the framework would protect our interests. We complied with the framework. We are still waiting. We endorse the position stated by the Keth Collective. They sat down. The chamber was very quiet. Ur-Ska called for the vote on the membership suspension review. The procedure required a 2/3 majority to pass. The vote ran through the standard system, each delegation registering in sequence. I watched the numbers on the display panel. The Vorath block voted yes, as expected. The elder race-aligned mid-tier species voted yes, also as expected. Then the abstentions began to register. 3 elder race delegations abstained, in order, without announcement, without explanation. Their abstention signals appeared in the column of the display where their yes votes had been assumed to be, and the numerical calculation shifted. The vote failed. The suspension review did not pass. The margin was not large, but it was a margin, and it was on the record. The chamber did not erupt the way it had when I said 2 words 9 days earlier. It was quieter than that. The silence was different. It was the silence of a room in which a great many calculations had just changed simultaneously, and everyone was sitting very still while they worked through what the new numbers meant. Ur-Ska said, without any audible change in his voice. The motion does not carry. The membership suspension review is dismissed. This session will recess for deliberations. He rose. He walked from the presiding position with the same measured authority he always carried. But I watched him as he walked, and somewhere in the way he moved, in something I could not name precisely but could feel in the room the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather, I understood what he had told me that morning. This was not a restoration. This was something else. I sat for a moment after most of the chamber had begun to move. Sovath appeared at my shoulder. He did not say anything, but I could feel him standing there, and there was something different in the way he stood. Some quality that the Threnny usually kept very carefully managed had shifted slightly. Finally he said, in a very low voice, "Ambassador." "Yes," I said. "I have been a council aide for 19 years, he said. "I have attended 411 formal sessions." I waited. 3 elder race abstentions, he said, in 1 vote, on a membership suspension review. "I know," I said. "In 19 years, he said, "I have never." "I know," I said again. I stood up. I collected my materials. I looked up through the wide windows of the chamber at the scatter of stars that marked the outer reach. 40,000 people in 3 systems. The people who had started all of this by simply existing in a place and refusing, by the basic fact of their presence and their life there, to be moved. I thought, I need to call Earth. And then, because I was very tired and a little stunned, and the day had been very long in ways that had nothing to do with the clock, I thought, I also need better coffee. I walked out of the chamber and into whatever came next. The council was not the same institution it had been 9 days ago. Everyone in that room knew it. The question now was, what kind of institution it was going to become, and whether the crack that had opened up could become a foundation for something better, or whether it would simply be a wound. I did not know the answer. I was not sure anyone in that chamber knew it yet. But I knew this. Earth had said no. We had stood in the silence that followed and not moved. And the world, or rather the galaxy, had not ended. What had ended was a certain kind of certainty, a 2,000-year assumption that the door was only a wall. Outside the chamber windows, the stars of the outer reach burned quietly, the way they always had. I had a message to send. I composed it walking down the corridor, speaking quietly into my recorder. Sovath 2 steps behind me, carrying everything I had forgotten to pick up from the table. "Earth, this is Ambassador Reyes. The Accord is dead. The suspension review did not pass. 3 elder race delegations abstained, which has not happened in living memory for anyone on this station. We are going to need a bigger staff. We are also going to need someone with a better understanding of council constitutional law than I have, because I believe that in the next several months, species that have been quiet in this institution for decades are going to start asking questions, and some of those questions are going to require answers that the current framework does not have." I paused. The corridor was empty, except for Sovath and me, and the low hum of the station around us. "I want to be clear," I said. "We did not plan this. We refused a document that was wrong, and we refused it because it was wrong, and the consequences of that refusal were real, and I am not dismissing them. But something else happened alongside the thing we planned, and I think it was the right thing. I think the species who spoke today have been waiting a very long time to speak. I think some of them are still trying to understand that they are allowed to. And I think our job now is to be in this institution in a way that shows them what it looks like when you believe that being allowed to say no is not a privilege. It is a foundation." I stopped at the door of my suite. Sovath stepped forward to open it. "I am going to sleep for approximately 9 hours, I said into the recorder. "Then I am going to answer 30 or 40 messages from delegations I have never spoken to before. Then we are going to figure out what comes next." I stopped the recording. I looked at Sovath. He looked at me. 19 years, he said. "I know," I said. "Not once," he said. "I know, Sovath." He considered something for a moment. Then he said, "I find myself hoping that it is a foundation." I looked at him. In 3 months of working together through consecutive impossible days, it was the first time he had told me what he hoped. It caught me off guard in a way that the vote and the abstentions and Oreska's quiet morning revelation had not quite managed. "Me too," I said. I went inside. I sat down at my desk. The outer reach was visible through the small window at the corner of the room, a faint cluster of light in the dark. 40,000 people, 3 systems, built things, stayed, refused to be moved. I turned on my console. There were 63 new messages. I started with the first one.